You're here to promote your latest book, as far as I understand, which is Knowing China, a 21st Century Guide. We come to China at a very, very interesting time, do we not, at present? Obviously, the presidency of President Xi Jinping and the changes that he seems to want to make, and the way that China is moving out further and further into the Western world. What does your book have to say about this?
Well, the book's idea is that we want to look at what we really know about China, which is a surprisingly amount, but which isn't really very much known within society and the media and also policymaking circles. So it wants to take the knowledge that we have about contemporary China, which, as I said, is very extensive, and make that accessible and also make it address the larger questions that we have about China, that we should have about China, that specialists are reluctant to ask quite often because they're so much locked up in their own specialization. So that's what the book wants to do. So it looks at things like the degree of freedom in Chinese society, the diversity in Chinese society, how that has grown and emerged over the last 20-25 years, and what that means for both ordinary Chinese and foreigners living in Chinese, but also for policymakers and politicians in China. It also looks at, for instance, the Chinese economy, cultural diversity. It looks at foreign relations, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the message of the book.
Your book seems to have won praise for taking a particularly China-centric approach in each of the chapters, as in moving away from the old debates and discussions about East versus West, developed versus developing. Was that the aim when you wrote your text?
Absolutely. If the book wants to do one thing, it's exactly that. It wants to look at the world, and it wants to look at China from a Chinese perspective, which is not the same as saying that it's China-friendly. So it's not a panda-hugging book. It is a book that is critical about China, but as it were on its own terms. So it wants to look at, for instance, how the Communist Party operates, how it rules Chinese society, how it devises and rolls out strategy, and wants to hold that up against the standards that it itself has about a well-operated and well-run Chinese society. So that's the China-centric aspect of it, and that's very different, as you already said in your question, from quite often the usual questions about China that are always asked from a Western perspective and implicitly or explicitly then want to measure China against the standards of what we think society and politics ought to be, which is always unfair, because what you do is you compare the reality in China against the ideal of what we think we are and should be.
China is making huge inroads, increasingly at present, into so-called Western capitalism. It is an increasingly huge player on the world stage. How well do you feel this sits with its still relatively poor human rights record?
Well, the obvious thing that you could say about this is that China, if it wants to be a real player in the world, it has to abide by universal human rights standards. However, it is also equally clearly not that simple, because economic freedoms, freedoms for enterprise and entrepreneurs, freedoms for trade and things like that, but also freedoms of movement of people to find jobs and create jobs wherever they want. These freedoms are very different from political freedoms, and that's also how the Communist Party perceives it. So if you want to look at the way that China operates in the world, it is increasingly based on entrepreneurship, on big and small enterprises, on people going out in the world, in Europe, in America, in Africa and Australia and everywhere else in the world. That is one thing, but it has actually very little to do with political freedoms more narrowly defined. It has a lot to do with the personal and economic freedoms that Chinese citizens enjoy and have been given and have exercised and expanded. That is very important, but that's a different thing from, say, the freedom of speech or other political freedoms.